When I was growing up, I had this daydream of finding a magic elevator. If I stood in the right spot and pressed the right button, I dreamed it would take me to another world. That world might be Atlantis, or Shangri-La, or Middle-earth, or Oz. Eventually, I found that elevator, but it brought me somewhere I didn't expect, a place called Dinotopia. Dinotopia is the one place on Earth where dinosaurs never went extinct. And humans and dinosaurs have formed a civilization together over thousands of years. This first came out as an illustrated book about 20 years ago, and in celebration of the 20th anniversary, I'd like to take you on a tour back to how Dinotopia came to be, what goes into the making of these realistic pictures of an imaginary world, and what it's like to live among 10-ton dinosaurs. I never expected that I would become a fantasy author. I come from a long line of mechanical engineers. My dad worked for the space program. In his spare time, he invented his own bicycles. His father pioneered sound and Technicolor for motion pictures. His father, my great-grandfather, started a company that made ball bearings, the Gurney Ball Bearing Company. The one thing that they all had in common was that they were all curious, and they passed this down on to me. They all wanted to know how things were made, how they would look if you took them apart. And they all believed in drawing. Not that they were artists, they were engineers. They used drawing as a way to figure out how things were made, how to put things together, how to bring things into being. My father once told me, everything begins with a drawing. And if you can draw something, you can create it. Outside my bedroom door was a stack of old National Geographic magazines, dating back all the way to about 1910. When everyone thought I was asleep at night, I would tiptoe into the hallway and read these old magazines, learning about expeditions to South America, hoping to find some new evidence of a lost city. I would go sit in my front yard with my Tonka trucks digging for my own lost cities, hoping to find dinosaurs or ancient Egyptian pharaohs. I never found anything, but this awoke a love, a fascination of archaeology. I ended up majoring in archaeology in college and then went on to art school. Later, I got a dream job working for National Geographic itself. My job as an archaeological illustrator was to travel on location with archaeologists and to try to reconstruct from the evidence in the ground what was the full picture of life in the ancient world. And at the end of each day of working with archaeologists, we would often sit around the campfire and talk about the dream of discovering a lost city. And it was then that I got the idea that I could create my own lost world. This is where the whole idea began, because the inspiration from this location caused me to paint Waterfall City. And that was the first painting of Dinotopia, a key location just like this, except imagine a huge city like Venice built in the heart of this waterfall. I came here as a college student, and I have come here many times since to paint these falls, to paint the way the water comes over the edge. You can photograph it, but you have to come here to paint it to actually see what it looks like. And I use the colors and effects from making studies on location to do my paintings of Waterfall City and to transport myself in my imagination to this world beyond our own of Dinotopia. After completing Waterfall City, I got the idea of painting other panoramic scenes of lost empires. And the first idea that came to mind was a parade of people and dinosaurs. This painting grew out of the ideas that were emerging from science in the 1980s. the idea that dinosaurs were more like birds rather than like reptiles. This revolutionized everything. If I could imagine that dinosaurs were warm-blooded and intelligent and dynamic creatures, what would it be like to live with dinosaurs? So I began by traveling to museums, talking to scientists, going on location, looking at dinosaur bones and footprints to try to visualize, to imagine what these creatures would look like. Often that meant doing studies of dinosaur skeletons in museums and to actually come in contact with the physical evidence of dinosaurs. So I did a series of drawings based on this idea of people and dinosaurs living together. And then I drew a map. And by drawing a map, I pulled together all these separate lost world ideas into a single island, filled with cities and jungles and canyons and mountains in the center. The mountains could contain the Ice Age mammals. So I invented a character named Arthur Denison, a Victorian explorer who had a lot of skills as an artist and a scientist. And I set the story in 1860 because I wanted to choose a time when a lot of the world was still unexplored and it seemed possible that there might be a place like Dinotopia still existing. So if this were to be an adventure story, a travel story, I wanted to make sure it was long enough to really have enough scope to develop this world, all the dimensions of this world of Dinotopia, how people lived, how the dinosaurs and humans communicated, the sports that they may have had, and some of the secrets that the island held of its distant past. In the second book, The World Beneath, we travel underneath the surface of the island to discover a huge network of caves and caverns where some ancient civilization within Dinotopia had stored these vehicles called strutters. The next book in the Dinotopia series, called First Flight, is an origin story, and it's really about the origin of this whole civilization. I had the idea that Dinotopia would have a period of struggle and sacrifice, an age of heroes, where not everything was perfect, and where the utopia that's now Dinotopia went through a dystopia, a troubled phase. The most recent Dinotopia book, called Journey to Chandara, takes us to the eastern part of the island, the city of Chandara, an ancient civilization of its own. And here is where you find the feathered dinosaurs. In the time since I did the first book, the science of dinosaurs has changed considerably, and a lot of new types of dinosaurs, especially feathered dinosaurs, have been discovered. And I wanted to include those in Dinotopia, and a lot of them are in the Chandara area. One of the challenges of creating the paintings for Dinotopia was how to paint realistic pictures of scenes that didn't exist. One of the things that I did was to start with a lot of sketches, loose sketches done in pencil or pen or marker to work out ideas just out of my imagination. I then did a storyboard to plan the entire book, 160 pages. Then for some of the major paintings, I went through a stage of doing a charcoal tonal study and a color study before doing the final painting. A lot of the ideas for light and color and form in Dinotopia come directly from my plein air studies outdoors on location. I'm a very dedicated plein air painter and sketcher, and by sketching real animals and birds, I get a lot of ideas for how dinosaurs would move and act and behave. And also I traveled to places like the Grand Canyon to get ideas for how Canyon City should look. And places like Toledo in Spain helped to inspire some of the cities in Dinotopia. Part of the process for getting realism was getting believable people. Sometimes that meant putting on a costume myself, posing in a mirror, and doing a charcoal study for a final painting. Other times I would find the right costume and stand out in the driveway and then use the self-timer on the camera to take reference photos. But if I needed a lot of different types of characters or kids or different people, I would have neighbors and friends come by the house and pose in the backyard. And we'd take photos of a lot of different people in groupings and then use those photos as reference for doing the final paintings. When it comes to getting realism for dinosaurs or vehicles or architecture, I like to build three-dimensional maquettes or miniatures, reference models, to use so that I can look at them from various angles and see how the lighting would work on those forms. So for example, this is a maquette for a vehicle that's based on the design of an invertebrate creature that appears in the world beneath. Let me show you some examples of how these maquettes work. For this dinosaur Bix, who's a protoceratops, I built a posable maquette out of oven-hardening clay. And that allowed me to see how the light and shade would play on that form. For the top of a Brachiosaurus, I wanted to see how a saddle would fit over the top, and the way I did that was by building a maquette. For the skybacks, another key part of the story, I built a posable maquette to use as reference to see how the skyback's rider would fit on the back of it. And for architecture, I use styrofoam and cardboard held together with a glue gun, and that allows me to see how the light and shadow would play on those forms. Sometimes I set up a little tableau, a scene with dinosaurs and little figures and an architectural setting so that I can see how that whole scene would look on a given sunny day. And then sometimes I take old plastic models and put them together in a different way to make a reference maquette for a dinosaur vehicle. What I wanted to do with Dinotopia was to create a doorway where the reader's imagination could become engaged and where we could travel to that point of contact between art and science and imagination, between fact and fantasy. And I think that's ultimately what fantasy is all about. It brings us together, it takes us to other worlds, and in so doing, it brings us to a greater appreciation of the magic of the world around us now.